is standing in the largest courtroom in America at the end of the 19th century. Every eye was fixed on the defendant's box. Everyone held their breath, searching for a single tear. But what they got in return was her chilling silence. That was Lizzie Borden, one of the most iconic killers in American criminal history. A female serial killer unlike anything we thought we knew about women of her era. A century later, America was once again shaken by another deeply controversial case involving a woman. This time, it was Dorothea Puente, the woman later dubbed the Death House Landlady. She lived quietly in a small home in Sacramento. She opened her doors to the elderly, the disabled, the homeless, those in need of a temporary place to stay, and a few government checks. She smiled at neighbors, served tea to police officers, and led them through the backyard as if it were just another quiet afternoon. And when one investigator bent down and pulled up what he thought was a root, that's when the real story began. When a demon wore the mask of an angel disguised as a kind, elderly woman. One question haunted me as I started to research Dorothea Puente. Is there a limit to human greed? Behind the surface of a mass murder case lies a true crime documentary about trust, how an entire community was deceived by the polished image of a gentle soul, supposedly devoted to society's most vulnerable. When people on F Street talked about Dorothea Puente, they often used the same words: gentle, kind, caring. She lived alone, nearly 60 years old, usually wore high-necked dresses and low-heeled shoes. Her house had a wooden porch painted regularly in white seasonal flowers and a small sign that read, "Boarding rooms for seniors, affordable rates." Police officers and social workers had come by for routine inspections. Everything inside the house was neatly arranged, tidy, and comfortable for anyone stepping in for the first time. To many, Dorothea was like a sweet old lady, an angel of kindness. She was often seen in places that made a good impression: churches, corner stores, pharmacies. She collected old clothes to distribute, bought food for stray cats, and always had a polite phrase ready for anyone who spoke to her. The whole city admired that gentleness. It fit what people expected of an elderly woman: soft-spoken, attentive, willing to help. In the community's eyes, she was the symbol of stability, something every woman was supposed to embody. Inside that house, everything followed a certain order. She kept records, managed prescriptions, and helped with benefit paperwork. The victims, mostly elderly or disabled, relied on her to manage their basic needs. Most of them lived alone, disconnected from family, with no one checking on their health or asking how they were. All their information went through her. She was the only point of contact and handled their documents each month. Dorothea was skillful at maintaining control. She held a central position by becoming the essential link, managing paperwork, filing for benefits, preparing medications, and making decisions on behalf of those who had no one else. Everything in that house ran like a self-managed service system. New tenants didn't need to understand it fully. They only needed to sign a few forms, follow instructions, and slowly become part of the cycle, where dependence was shaped through routine. In criminal psychology case files, experts often call this passive control, a form of manipulation rooted in structural dependence. By simply maintaining her role as the middle person in every essential process, control became a natural part of the system. Later, police collected a wide range of documents: benefit checks, room rental applications, and medical treatment lists for the tenants. But aside from administrative traces, there were no personal photos, no record of relationships. These individuals existed in the system like drifting names, marked only by signatures and identification numbers. They were former inmates, people with disabilities, elderly individuals cut off from their families, the kinds of people living on the margins of the welfare system. Some struggled with addiction, others battled mental illness. Each had their own reason for ending up at that house: a place to sleep, a spot to wait for the next check, or simply nowhere else to go. Taking advantage of their vulnerable situations, Dorothea persuaded them to register their benefits at her address. She then collected the checks herself, handed over a small amount, and quietly pocketed the rest. They began to disappear once they had nothing left to offer. One social worker later testified, "We believed they had just moved out." In the system, for individuals who are homeless or undocumented, disappearing often isn't considered unusual. That response, which sounded plausible on paper, became the very loophole Dorothea exploited. There were, however, reports that some tenants had tried to raise concerns. Social services summoned Dorothea for questioning 15 times. Yet instead of taking action, they merely warned her not to collect checks on behalf of others and advised against housing elderly individuals in her home. No enforcement followed. It wasn't until November 1988 that police finally took notice. A mentally ill homeless man named Alvaro Montoya went missing after being taken in by Dorothea. He had been referred by a rehabilitation center, seeking a more stable environment for him. When the center lost contact with Alvaro, Dorothea explained that he had gone on a vacation. Among the many who had passed through her house, Alvaro stood out. He had a long history of mental health treatment and had lived in multiple psychiatric care facilities before arriving at Dorothea's. Because he had a detailed medical file and a social worker assigned to his case, the break in communication raised concern. For the first time, a home visit was recommended. One investigator later wrote, "This case revealed the chilling failure of a system meant to support the vulnerable, yet it allowed them to vanish unnoticed." Dorothea had exploited that blind spot, where numbers replace people, and a female serial killer could hide multiple deaths right in the middle of a neighborhood. When social workers requested an on-site inspection, local police officers were sent to assist. They arrived and questioned her directly, but she continued to lie, insisting that Alvaro had gone on vacation. In the quiet residential neighborhood at the heart of Sacramento, where low porches and white picket fences made everything look like an old postcard, the presence of two uniformed officers immediately drew attention. A woman living across the street stepped onto her porch. She asked, "Another one? Gone missing?" The question caught one officer's attention. "You mean this has happened before?" The woman replied, "Every few months there's a moving truck, but I never see anyone actually move out." That was the first piece of a fractured picture. Another neighbor, living right next door, said she would sometimes smell something sharp and bitter early in the morning. Suspicion grew after several residents noticed strange behavior from a homeless alcoholic nicknamed Chief, whom Dorothea had hired to do odd jobs. According to witness statements, she repeatedly asked Chief to dig holes in the basement, tear down the garage, and pour new cement over the old garage floor. Shortly after finishing the work, Chief disappeared. Later, they would call it the polite way of killing. When investigators began interviewing people who had stayed in the house, they noticed disturbing patterns. Each new tenant was asked by Dorothea to hand over their identification, under the pretense of helping with benefits paperwork. At first, they trusted her, but within weeks, most of them appeared lethargic, slept excessively, kept to themselves, and hardly ever left their rooms. One witness recalled, "I asked Alvaro why I hadn't seen him outside lately. He looked at me for a long time and then whispered, almost under his breath, 'I feel like I'm not supposed to leave, but I'm not even sure anymore.'" According to criminal psychology experts, this is a form of control through cognitive ambiguity, where victims are isolated from the outside world and become entirely dependent on their caregiver. And when an investigator reviewed old medical files, they found a disturbing detail. In several past deaths at Dorothea's home, the cause had been listed as natural. But there were no doctors on scene and no formal autopsy was ever requested. From there, the inconsistencies began piling up. Some documents contained mismatched signatures under the same name. Government checks were still being issued, but the recipients were no longer seen. And by that point, the investigators knew something was definitely wrong in that house. It seemed like such a simple case, one that could have been prevented with just a bit of proper attention. So why did it unfold so easily? That was the question that haunted me most while studying this killer's case file. When police arrived to investigate, a man named John Sharp, who was staying at Dorothea's house, initially backed up her story. But just as the officers were about to leave, John quietly confessed that Dorothea had forced him to lie. A search warrant was issued one morning in November. The backyard of 1426 F Street had been recently dug up and messily refilled, and the garage floor had been freshly sealed with concrete. They decided to excavate the garden. Dorothea agreed, and even offered the investigators a few shovels. For the first time in years, the soil was turned over in search of answers to suspicions that had lingered too long. The first body found was that of a middle-aged man. His clothes were intact. His wallet still contained a few folded dollar bills. A few hours later, 2 more bodies were recovered from the damp earth. Each dig revealed a piece of a story long buried. Testimonies that once felt vague were now coming into focus. As for Dorothea, while officers were busy searching the premises, she asked to step out and get a cup of coffee. Since she had not yet been considered a suspect, they allowed her to leave. She immediately fled to Los Angeles. By the time police discovered the 9th body in her yard, a warrant had been issued for her arrest. In Los Angeles, Dorothea met up with a recent acquaintance, but this person had seen the news reports and recognized her from the television. They contacted the police, and Dorothea was arrested. On the way to the station, she asked the officer beside her, "Can I fix my makeup before the photo?" The room went silent. It seemed like the perfect reflection of the image she had so carefully crafted. A polite, well-mannered older woman, so composed that even while being accused of murder, she still wanted to look presentable. One seasoned investigator remarked, "I used to think I could spot a bad person just by looking them in the eyes. This case taught me that sometimes excessive kindness is the first sign of manipulation." During interrogation, Dorothea showed little emotion. She spoke softly, sometimes smiling. Her answers were carefully prepared, much like the breakfast she used to cook for her tenants, pleasant, appealing, and just the right portion. Psychological records later revealed a history of manipulation, false identities, and financial crimes. But no one expected that those very skills, when applied within a social welfare setting, would become tools of death. She didn't need violence or threats. With patience disguised as care, Dorothea quietly eliminated people within the system to serve her goals. What makes this case so haunting is how it unfolded under complete trust. A woman who manipulated an entire system simply by understanding one truth about human nature. Everyone wants to believe in kindness. More than 5 months, she was sentenced to life in prison for 3 of them. Prosecutors admitted that most of the bodies had decomposed too far to present direct evidence. She remained calm throughout the proceedings. At the trial, Dorothea's defense attorney argued that an unhappy childhood, a string of failed marriages and personal losses, along with the burden of caring for the homeless, had turned her into a cold-blooded woman. They also tried to portray Dorothea as once being a kind and compassionate person by bringing in numerous individuals she had helped in the past, including 2 daughters she had adopted. However, the prosecution pointed out that she had consistently exploited the vulnerable, stealing what little assistance they received and ending their lives once they no longer served her purpose or dared to resist. The arguments from both sides forced the jury to deliberate for nearly a month before delivering the final verdict. Dorothea would serve life in prison with no possibility of parole. Until the end of her life, Dorothea continued to claim innocence and insisted that all her victims had died from natural causes. In the aftermath, the state of California was forced to review the entire system of social housing oversight. The welfare system came under heavy pressure for reform, but the damage to public trust could not be measured. I revisited the case file years later. The transcripts, the handwritten notes, the letters sent from prison, all of it pointed to one undeniable truth. Dorothea Puente had shattered every ideal we hold about the image of a dignified woman. People often speak of serial killers as psychological anomalies. But what happens when the perpetrator is a respected member of the community? When she cooks for the homeless, smiles at social workers, and lives quietly within a network of trust? Is that why we trusted so easily? Is human trust really that fragile, so cheap, and so easily exploited? The case of Dorothea Puente, much like Lizzie Borden's, forced an entire community to question its own moral compass. If someone can both care for and eliminate another human being, what defines the true nature of that act? It also revealed how cruelty, when masked by composure and silence, can go unnoticed, especially when it comes from a woman. I closed the file. On the cover, the name Dorothea Puente was printed in smudged black ink. The case may be closed, but its echoes linger in every policy change, every community housing review, and every wary glance toward elderly people with no one left beside them. And the final question still remains unanswered. How many more times must we be hurt before we learn to notice the smallest signs, before it's too late?